artist and writer for Places, and a research professor of art and design at Caltech. In my Places article that was published recently called Survey to Surveillance, I take issue with the idea that the U.S Mexico border is actually a border line, because that's been so much of the focus of the conversation over the last, 4 years basically. And instead, I try to reframe it as a network diagram. And what I mean by that is that it is not actually only characterized by the line that is at the border itself, which we know has walls and surveillance infrastructure and so on along it, and is also patrolled. In fact, people who are being patrolled, who are not U.S. citizens, are being patrolled everywhere in the United States. They're not just being patrolled along the U.S. Mexico border. And so if we think a little bit differently about what the border actually means, which is that it is a way of defining what is and isn't, or who is and isn't included in the United States, then we can start thinking about how that happens spatially in a very different way than it does if we just think about it as a single line. The U.S. Mexico border was first established in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and that treaty was a written document, and there was a map that was appended to it that showed where the authorities wanted the borderline to be. And it was based on discussions that they had about where particular geographic points that they were aware of. They realized that there was a mismatch between what was on that map and what they discovered on the ground. And so they had to renegotiate actually what was part of the United States with Mexico. And that resulted in the Gadsden Purchase, which was in 1853. So maps that are drawn by people who don't know the location often are limited in terms of what they describe. The U.S.-Mexico boundary, as I mentioned, was established first through authorities that were not actually located in the Southwest. And then they sent a survey party out to mark the boundary line with markers, and also to take a survey of what was actually in the territory that was claimed by the United States. So they wanted to know things like, what was there to mine? What is the nature of the geology? What are the other natural resources that are there? So zoological and botanical and paleontological information, they were collecting that. They were also wanted to know who were the people that were in the area, because they were claiming a territory in order to actually occupy it. All of that material was collected by a survey team that was comprised of scientists and artists and topographical engineers that were part of the U.S. Army. They compiled all of this material into a document called the U.S. Mexico Boundary Survey Commission Report. It has all this writing in it of the things that I just described, and it also has a lot of scientific illustrations. 19th century naturalist impulse to collect and sort of categorize and classify all of the natural world. That's the realm that they were operating in. There were these illustrations that were illustrating and classifying, giving Latin names to all sorts of plants and animals and things like that. They're totally not interested in the names that the native people had for them, or they're sort of putting their own view on top of it. What I have here are 2 photographs that I took of the U.S. Mexico Boundary Commission Survey Report. They're actually from a copy of it that is in the special collections at USC. I was particularly interested in this copy because you could kind of see there are like ink stains on the facing pages of the illustrations that really sort of show that this is something which has a certain kind of material ephemerality to it, whereas the document itself, the authority of the document itself transcends that material ephemerality, right? So there's something about that that's really fascinating to me, is that sort of tension. In this case, we're looking at some images of seeds that are organized in a grid. So it's sort of, the aesthetics of that are that you see that there is a certain kind of classification impulse that's reflected in the drawing itself, where they're organized in a way that is according to certain kinds of human-made categories. These are very specific kinds of illustrations that were used and are used by scientists to recognize species. That's this 19th century version of things. In my essay, and also in this project in general, Survey to Surveillance, what I'm doing is drawing a through line between that scientific impulse to classify what is in the territory as a way of claiming it and controlling it, to contemporary ways of doing that. If we look at contemporary modes of surveillance, and we don't only focus on land surveillance at the U.S. Mexico border, if we don't think about only that, and we think about other modes of surveillance that the U.S. is using to surveil migrant and immigrant communities, what we have is a vast network of data that's collected by the Department of Homeland Security. I mean, Department of Homeland Security includes a lot of different organizations, but the ones that are sort of most relevant in terms of this through line to the survey parties of the 19th century are ICE and the Customs and Border Patrol. And what they do is collect all kinds of data, and by doing so, they're mapping in many immigrant communities. They describe the data that they collect and how they organize it in terms of profiles. So they talk about profiling individuals and diagramming network of entire communities. As a professor at Caltech, I work a lot with computer scientists and software developers. In fact, we do a lot of work with data visualization and developing software that is used by scientists to understand their own data. I am aware of how data is something that one chooses to collect data in the first place. It's an idea somebody has, right? To say like, oh, wouldn't it be interesting if we had data that showed us such and such a phenomena? That's a choice. And then how it's organized, the correlations that one makes between different data sets, all of that happens through human curiosity. When I think about the border and all of this scientific and classification work that is being done by technologists and scientists and engineers to organize the border in a particular kind of way, I am very aware also as an artist that it's not the only way that you can organize your information about the border, and it's not the only way that you can think about what you want to know about the border at all, right? So when I write about this idea of the border being malleable in Survey to Surveillance, I'm really talking about that, which is that one could choose, if there were political will, right, to actually construct the border and the priorities of the data, the use of the data in a very different way. Conversation with this sort of history and contemporary condition of the border as something that has been constructed through scientific and engineering practices over the last 2 centuries. I took a group of artists and scientists, particularly geologists from Caltech where I work, who also have artistic practices and who have field practices where they do field drawing and other kinds of field imaging. And we went to a location that is highly significant in the U.S. Mexico Boundary Commission Survey Report, which is called Carrizo Creek. It's in the southeast Anza Borrego Desert in a very remote location. It's also in a place that's not built up. It's a naturally preserved location. So when we went out there, to me it was really actually kind of intense because I had been looking at the Boundary Commission survey report for so long that going to this place, I felt like I could see the pictures in the Boundary Commission survey report in front of me in the landscape. We went out there to really have a conversation among ourselves and in dialogue with this history and these contemporary border surveillance practices to think about what it is to observe and to record a landscape in a political context and to use scientific practices to underwrite the authority of the observations that whoever it is making. We used our own artistic methods to sketch in these locations, and we also did some drawings that were in conversation with some of the geological geological diagrams that are in the Boundary Commission survey report and talked about when you're going to draw geological strata, for example, what would you look for? How would you note that? What would that look like? And why is that different than what an artist might do, which is to take out her watercolors and sketch a particular thing, trying to collect something that's more affective or phenomenological, and why does one image and one perspective connote authority more than another?